Good.
Thanks again for give us these minutes to talk with you.
Sure.
How I told you, we are working on our strategy class about your paper of 2001, but we are working in the 2005 edition that is republished on 2005. And now that you are with us, we want to make you a few questions about your paper, not only about your paper, but about your recent work as well. How I told you, we are in the strategy class of the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia, that actually has a very close connection with the McCombs University. Actually, our MBAs of the 2011 was in your university last year.
Okay.
And we want to talk about your work. So first, we want to tell you to ask you about how do you define in a few words a strategy?
How do I define strategy?
Yes.
Well, to me, it's the kind of it's the sum total of decisions that executives make that define their arenas, vehicles, differentiators, staging, and economic logic. So I don't have a nice kind of succinct, definition. It strategy reflects the commitments that executives make to those domains. If you go back to Mintzberg, he says strategy is first he said it was a pattern in a stream of decisions, later recognizing that it doesn't take conscious decisions to produce strategy. He said it's basically a pattern in a stream of actions. And, I think that's a pretty apt characterization.
Okay. Do you about your theory that we already read? Do you consider that now that the service industry is taking more importance than the manufacturing industry, do you consider the channels part of the science of the vehicles, or that depends of the type of company?
Well, I mean, I think that the choice of channels, is probably it's pretty critical. But I think that you could consider that as part of under arenas, whether and in terms of value creation stages. I think you could easily address it as an alternative arena, particularly part of value creation, where you're going, how many of the stages you're going to participate in between you and the customer. And if you consider alternative channels, I think that could be easily accommodated as a choice of arenas.
Okay. And how can you frame the cluster and sharing service centers in your theory?
How can I frame what?
The clusters and the sharing center services that is taking more important recently?
Well, I'm not sure I know what you mean when you say the clusters.
I mean, when the companies is trying to work in clusters, like for example, in Holland, when they have the flowers clusters, when all the companies work together, like they try to frame
Well,
all the industry in the
well,
strategy.
I mean, you know, arrangements like joint ventures or other cooperative arrangements, those would be considered vehicles.
Okay.
So I mean, you might you would have some kind of loose affiliation between firms, and that would be a vehicle.
Okay. We noticed that you use some theories like the five forces of Michael Porter as a note in your paper. Do you think that what do you think about this type of theory that has almost 30 years? Do you think that this is still valid?
Oh, sure, but five forces is pertinent to understanding, first and foremost, the nature of competition. And so, and an analysis of industry structure, which is what you use five forces for, is an analysis of one part of the external environment. So it's just, it's a helpful way to think about one part of the external environment.
Okay. Um, and how I told you, we're working on your 2005 version of the paper. Is there any recent update about your paper? Do you think that there is any adaptation to the recent years?
I'm not aware of it. I mean, there are a lot of companies and a lot of schools that use that strategy diamond to think about their strategy. And I mean, and schools that use it to teach about strategy. And I hope it's still relevant. I think that, you can make modest refinements to it depending on the situation of a particular company. But I think that, it's got pretty widespread applicability. I mean, all it is, it's simply what I tell students all the time is if you're going to evaluate strategy, if you're going to communicate strategy, if you're going to decide to change the strategy, the first step in that is you have to have a way to describe the strategy. And the strategy diamond gives you a way to operationalize and describe the strategy. And that's the first step in doing any of those things that I just mentioned.
Okay. And what tools like the balance scorecard, scenario planning, do you think that are useful to work in the strategy? Because right now we are seeing a lot of tools, but we can't differentiate which one are relevant and which not.
Well, look, I mean, what you've got to realize is that any tool, any analytical or conceptual tool has its shortcomings. And, any framework, just like the strategy diamond, it has some shortcomings that it basically says that you need to focus on these five areas. I personally think those are the critical areas that people need to attend to if they're going to address issues of strategy. But, whether it's balanced scorecard or five forces or anything, they're a way to kind of organize your thinking about very complex things, but they all have some shortcomings.
Okay. Um, Also, we saw a paper that they published in 2010 about sharing the wealth that is focused on corporate compensation. So,
Yep.
can you tell us a little more about that, and if you think that is complementary to the Michael Porter's theory of shared value or is opposite to it?
Well, I'm not sure I know when you say Porter's theory of shared value, I'm not sure I know precisely what you're talking about there. So it would be hard for me to comment on it. I mean, what we found is that, in our study was that firms where there was less variation in the pay among members of the top team who weren't the CEO, that they performed better. But it all depended on whether they were highly diversified or not. But it addresses this whole issue of executive pay that's out of control, and I just think it remains out of control.
Can you tell us a little more about your conclusions of this paper to share with us?
Well, I mean, so have you looked at the paper?
No, because I only read it, but my classmate didn't. So maybe you can tell them a little more about it.
Well, we're just looking at whether if there's a lot of variation in the pay of members of the top management team who aren't the CEO, whether that variation has important consequences. Because if people are expected to work as a team, you probably can't pay them very different compensation. Or what that does is, they if they work closely together and they see the contributions that everyone makes, it'll be very hard for them to accept the fact that some people on the team are paid a lot more than others on the team, yet they're all supposed to contribute similarly to the team. And if you pay them very differently, some people are paid a lot more than others, then they won't work as a team. Some of them will sabotage the efforts of the group. Some of them will just not work very hard themselves. So you've got to be very concerned among groups of executives that are expected to cooperate and work together. You've got to be concerned about how you pay them. If they don't have to work very closely together, say that they're in a company that's it's got very unrelated diversification, and they really can operate their businesses as independent businesses, then it's not as much of a problem because they're really not expected to cooperate much, and they don't see one another's performance, and the performance of one unit doesn't affect the other unit. So you need to be sensitive to the pay differences among executives if they are expected to work as a team.
Okay, I appreciate that because I really think that is a very interesting paper, and I think that my classmate must read it. Do you think that companies as well and the countries as well as companies must work on their strategies using this framework, the framework of the original paper?
Well, I haven't thought about it as it applies to countries. I've thought about it as it applies to not-for-profits generally. I do think that one important recognition, whether it's a country or a corporation or a not-for-profit organization, is they need to recognize they can't do everything. And so deciding what they're going to do, if it's a country, which services they will provide and which they won't, how they're going to provide them. I mean, those are important choices, and when you give some real thought to those choices, chances are that you will make better choices. Okay. So, but I haven't thought much about, expanding that beyond an organization level.
Okay, and finally, do you have any perception about Latin American companies, and especially about Colombian companies?
Well, I did a lot of. We have a MBA program in Mexico City, and I taught the strategy course in that for the first almost 15 years. So I taught that course up until about 6 years ago, and so I used to travel down there a lot. And then I've done some work in Latin America, in Argentina. I've spoken in Colombia, but it's been a long time for that, since I've done that. I don't follow Colombian companies personally, so I can't speak in any informed way about Colombian companies. I have great memories of times that I've spent in Latin America. Always enjoyed the students I have there. My students there were a lot of fun to teach. I think their societies faced a lot of difficulties that were even more deep-seated than in the U.S. And I think that a lot of the companies were expected to do more than just, operate as for-profit organizations in terms of, providing more in the way of social welfare and things like that. One of the concerns I had when I was doing things in Mexico City and in Mexico was that I had a lot of students who I thought were very good, but because they weren't as politically connected or their families weren't as politically connected, they didn't necessarily get all of the opportunities that I think that their ability suggested they should have. Does that make sense?